Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures. I'm excited about this episode with Joni Kindwall-Moore. Her company, Snacktivistfoods.com, is doing amazing work to help educate the world about ancient grains, gluten intolerances, diabetes, how we can eat foods with grain in them that are actually healthy for our bodies, the soil science, the agricultural regeneration movement, hydroponics. This conversation ranges, yes, into the science. We get pretty nerdy at times. We also talk about her journey as an entrepreneur, about building a company and what that process has been like. So with my background in bioengineering, this conversation spanning between the science and the startups, I am just delighted that she was able to carve out time to have this conversation with me, and I'm happy to share it with you. So if you are watching, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. And if you're listening, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com. And there you'll see more extensive show notes to the things that we talk about today, as there are a lot of different rabbit trails to follow. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with Joni Kindwall-Moore. All right, Joni, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited for this conversation. It's been a pleasure to meet you and learn about your company. And, you know, you and I both come from a bio background, and even in our earlier conversations talking about all things bioscience and nutrition and public health and personal health, it dives into a number of extremely nerdy conversations that I know that you and I are game to get into. So in this conversation, I think we're going to dive into some of that, also try to keep it in explanatory for a more general audience. But why don't we start, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you're up to these days.
Okay, yeah. So I live in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which is the northern part of Idaho, and I'm a mom of 3 children, and I've had a varied career. So I started out my career pathway in the hard sciences. I have a degree in botany and was an ethnopharmacologist and did a lot of work with soil sciences and plant chemistry and whatnot. And in my 30s, I decided to become a nurse. I was really passionate about working with people one-on-one, and my husband had gone into healthcare. And so that inspired me to actually go into healthcare and work with people hands-on. So I spent over 10 years in ICU and diabetic education, emergency, and mostly critical care. And so, a few years back, I had some personal challenges with my children, having food allergies, and have always been really passionate about healthy eating and food security and food systems. I actually have a really nerdy passion surrounding the whole concept of how we're going to feed a growing planet, in the face of climate change and scarcity of arable lands. And so that's what led me to found a company in the food space. So I founded Snacktivist Inc. In a very small scale level in 2015, literally just like built a little website, put a couple products on it, started talking to customers, and have taken it from there. So now I'm a full-time CEO founder, and recently my husband joined our team full-time as well. And I just really feel like we can make a considerable dent on our health and on our planet through food.
So what was it? So in your schooling and in your early days, diving into science and working on the bench, what were you working on? Like, what were the areas back in the day that you were into?
So my passions early on at the bench were initially studying serotonin receptor sites and migraine prophylaxis and the development of medications that may affect migraines. And so we worked on a number of things, from plants to animal extracts. Actually, we even explored tropical snails from Borneo, of all things, and really just had that full view of how anything could affect the pathophysiology of a human in a disease process. So my specialty has always been plants. I was very uniquely interested in the allelopathic interactions of plants, like how if you harvest a medicinal plant that is growing in a diverse situation like a jungle, say like the Amazon, you can't take that one isolated plant and grow it in a monocrop situation. Usually you will not have the same chemical profile. And if you do, sometimes you're lacking some of the other co-chemicals needed to produce that medicinal effect in a pharmacological kind of a way. So that was my early interest. I did get to spend some time in the Amazon. And interestingly enough, it was one of the things that one of the medicine men we were working with, he was an interesting guy, and he and I were sitting one afternoon and talking, and he told me that he was perplexed by Westerners, that we would spend so much time investigating all these novel medicines and pills and extracts when we failed to realize that healing starts on the plate, and it was really the food that was causing a lot of our disease in the first place. In addition to other things. So that really kind of set me on a path of really thinking about food from a medicinal perspective.
Got it. And then your times in nursing in the medical field, what kind of work were you up to there?
Yeah, well, my focus was intensive care. So really you're keeping people alive who would otherwise be dead. So that's truly what intensive care is. Ventilators, all the machines that do your normal processes that keep you alive, breathing, heart beating, etc. And we do them artificially through either pacers or ventilators or other complex machinery. And I worked a lot in cardiovascular care, post cardiovascular surgery, worked a lot with people with heart attacks and stenting and bypass surgeries, etc. And also worked in diabetic education quite a bit. That was actually outside in an outpatient setting, but got to work with some very brilliant endocrinologists and general practitioners who were really passionate about really how do we meet people, especially rural people and people who may not be as literate or have access, like food deserts, or have the understanding or culture surrounding health food and healthy eating, and how we can impact diabetes, essentially. So diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and stroke, blood pressure, that whole, cluster. So really cool work there as well.
So what was the origin story of starting Snacktivist? Like, what were those first couple of products? What was the impetus for giving it a go?
Right. So for many years, I ate more of like a kind of a typical like salad, fruit, almonds, things like that. Some ancient grains, mostly like quinoa or like whole cooked, sorghum and whatnot. And then when I had kids, we suddenly had more of a demand for baking. And I've always avoided a lot of wheat products. Like, I'm not celiac. I can eat wheat. I enjoy some wheat products, but in minimum quantities. I grew up as a kid on a farm who always wanted to drive combine, but I couldn't. It was the best money. Everybody wanted to drive combine, but I would get out there and after an hour, they'd have to pull me off the combine because my eyes would swell shut. And I still continue to have kind of a wheat allergy to this day. If I eat a lot of it, I get really itchy and get what's called urticaria. Like, I'll get like little hives everywhere. So I generally avoid it. But when I suddenly had kids, and here I'm sending them to school, and they kept coming home and saying, the kids are teasing us because we eat such weird food, and why can't we just have pizza and cookies and, all the stuff that like normal kids eat. And so I started exploring other options and making flours out of ancient grains and, just exploring things that were anything but commodity blended processed wheat as a basis for food, trying to mimic some of the normal typical foods that kids want. And our son had a very challenging period where they had been eating some more processed wheat products, with both parents working full time, really demanding, hours. You can imagine how hard it is to feed a family in a healthful way because you're kind of in survival mode. But so he had been eating some more processed wheat products, and it set off a really adverse health event for him where he developed what's called mesenteric adenitis. So it's when the glands in your abdomen start to swell. Adenitis, kind of like tonsillitis, but it's in your abdomen, to where you could actually feel them in his belly. It was like little golf balls in there. And he had, weight loss and chronic abdominal pain. And we found that, after hours, even with pediatric GI specialists, that it was honestly just wheat that was triggering that reaction, processed wheat foods. So once we corrected that, and when he would eat grains, he would eat minimally processed whole grain, ancient grains. Everything corrected itself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
so to go
Yeah.
one level deeper there on the science, if we might take a little detour, what was going on? What was it about these processed grains that was causing such a reaction?
Yeah, there's we've really, speculated a lot about what it was because the thing about the digestive tract is you have A, the person and their physiology, but then you have B, a whole nother organism, which is your intestinal flora. And they really are kind of two separate entities. For many years, I've been frustrated that we actually don't treat them as kind of two patients.
Mm,
You say that at a hospital, people laugh at you because it's too forward thinking. But mark my words, 20 years from now, we will treat it like that. We will treat patients and patients' microbiome respectively. If I think that's where we're going. We just don't understand the science yet to really take it there. But so it's unclear whether it was him reacting. He was negative for celiac, or maybe if it was a intestinal flora reaction. So we're not totally sure. But he's since become a little teenage rebel and sneaks off and eats, all kinds of stuff, and doesn't seem to have the adverse reaction that he once did. So perhaps it was a maturity issue. Perhaps it was a change in his microflora that has allowed him to have better tolerance for processed grains.
got it. And so what is it? So
Yeah.
for people unfamiliar with celiac disease, for people unfamiliar with gluten, what is gluten?
Yeah.
What is up? People hear these terms, but they don't know what it means. Could you educate us a little
Yeah, sure. There's a ton of confusion actually around that whole kind of misnomer. It's funny because my company, Snacktivist Foods, has a line of gluten-free foods. However, I tend to be a little frustrated with the term gluten-free. I mean, gluten is a protein. It's one of the reasons why wheat actually has a interesting nutritional profile because it is a higher protein grain because gluten is a protein. It's a combination of two proteins actually that come together. And for people who are celiac is an autoimmune disease. So their body recognizes gluten as a compound, as a protein, and it goes, oh no, this is a problem. And it launches like an autoimmune reaction where the body attacks its own lining of the digestive tract. It like perceives it as an invader and it goes to destroy it. And that's why celiac can be so sensitive. It really only takes a very small particulate to set off that whole reaction. For somebody who has a gluten intolerance or an intolerance to wheat in general, there's a couple of different camps. I mean, there are people who say it's gluten, but I still think we need to explore that more. I mean, do they react the same if we give them an isolated gluten, like, powdered gluten? Or is it wheat? Is it a combination of things? Is it a impairment to digest it? There's a lot of unclear science there. There's certainly a population of people who have an allergy to wheat in general. And that can be specifically wheat, or it can be other gluten-containing grains like barley, rye, citricale, other things that contain gluten, because gluten is in several types of cereal grains.
Got it. All right. Well, part of even what I said at the beginning, why I'm excited about this conversation, is I think we're going to interweave the science,
Yeah.
the health science, with the startup journey, with the entrepreneurial journey. So, coming back to the
Right.
entrepreneurial journey, those initial products, how did you start the process of building the business, the team, acquiring customers? What was that like?
Well, that's been quite a process, to be honest, because I didn't have an MBA and I didn't have that rich business background. And in fact, when I started Snacktivist, I had never even really worked for an organization that allowed to have, open collaborative meetings. Like if you work for academia back in the 90s, or you worked for Forest Service, or you worked for hospitals, it's kind of a show up and shut up policy. It's not like, ping pong tables and collaborative meetings like at Google. It's just not. And so like this whole understanding of like creating an organization that, honors people's input and it's a true team kind of spirit, it's actually, I've had to really reinvent the way I think. I naturally think that way, but I had it beat out of me, especially as a nurse. Nurses kind of culturally are kind of, you're there to be seen, not heard. Don't show up with too many good ideas. It's a problem. That kind of culture. So that's been interesting to go from being a nurse to a leadership position. Actually takes some coaching. So as far as the entrepreneurial journey, I started out kind of solopreneur, like a lot of people do. Quickly learned that that would not scale us to the scale that we want to be because we're trying to build an enterprise. Starting out solopreneur style and person with an idea and a solution and, but not like an organization behind me. I quickly learned that we wouldn't get anywhere trying to do what we're trying to do without a really, really well-oiled machine behind us and a good organization. So I really tapped the brakes and stalled and said, okay, we're going to build out our back end. Like, how's this going to look? We need to create the relationships with the farmers. We need to create relationships with universities. I need a very sophisticated executive team that's done this before. Really expert cash management. And so we've spent the last 3 years really building that part. And I brought on some very amazing executives last year, right before COVID, actually, like that kind of period. And it's amazing how it just takes the whole organization to another level because suddenly I see us working as a very tight machine. So super cool.
That's great. And so what was the journey of those initial customers? Like how were you gathering feedback from the customers? What was that, iterating on products? What was that like?
Yeah, that's a great question because that part was really fun and very interesting. And I have to say one of the benefits to using kind of that lean startup methodology is that you can make a product, become a real company, and as long as it's not COVID and things are normal, you can find a handful of independent natural specialty stores, farmers markets, etc., that will allow you to start testing it on real people. And I have to say, like, you go to Expo West, which is like a big food and beverage, global event, actually, where like you see these giant brands that are launching with millions of dollars behind them, but you can tell that they've not done a lot of live consumer testing sometimes. Like, they've got this great idea, they do all the perfect branding, they take it to market, but they really don't know if it's what people want yet. And we quickly learned our first iterations of Snacktivist were like uber healthy, like super duper healthy, super duper whole grain, very minimal sugar, only coconut sugar in small moderations. And people were like, that's too healthy. I'm not eating that. So we weren't even going to do sweets. Like, I was like, we're not making sweets. I personally don't like sweets. I don't really eat sweets. And so I was like, we're going to stick to the savory things that substitute for crackers, bread, kind of staples. But within a few events, I was working on a brownie mix because that's what people asked me to do. Yeah. So you have to listen to your customers, and we talked to them and they said, we don't care if it's got sugar. Could you make it organic? Because we're not planning to eat this every day. It's a treat. It's like a conscientious indulgence. We want it to be vegan. We want it to be gluten-free. We want it to be whole grain, and we want it to be from organic sugar. So that's what we did.
So let's talk about sugars for a moment. I'm not sure coconut sugar is something I'm super familiar with, but cane sugar, coconut sugar, processed sugar, honey,
all sugar.
At the end of the day, what is the difference of all these different types of sugars?
Nothing really. I mean, it's like when it comes down to that sugar component, it's still metabolized by your body as sugar, but they're metabolized at different rates. So that is a differentiating thing. Like, the more processed it is, the faster it's absorbed into the blood system, and the poorer the mineral content. Like, cane itself has been used traditionally it's one of the earliest crops that was ever domesticated in Asia. And when you go to Asia and you spend time in Asia, it's a revered medicinal plant. I mean, if you're sick or, certain situations, they give you fresh pressed cane juice. In fact, if like in rural Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, it's considered like a part of their kind of cultural food heritage. And so it's interesting because, in typical American fashion or whatever, we've extracted it, we've maximized it, and now we've like put it in everything. And I think it's done really bad things to sugar, in general, just because of abuse and excess processing.
And so the processing then, just to get into the biochemical nature of it, Isn't cane sugar and coconut sugars and other types of sugars, is it just because there's other particulate around it, other fibers or
Yeah,
other minerals, similar to the salt conversation? But on sugar, what are the
yeah,
things that are around honey or that are around coconut sugars that make
yeah.
them be digested at different rates?
Well, honey is kind of a different beast because it's fructose. And so it's actually a more quickly absorbed sugar, but it has a lot of enzymes. Like if it's pure honey that hasn't been processed, it actually has other things in it that are not like beyond just the fructose. Like it's sweet, but it's enzymatically rich. It has other things. Cane sugar, coconut palm sugar. I mean, they're literally just dried juice or sap, and so you get more of the full components. Corn syrup, on the other hand, or beet sugar, I mean, you have a highly, highly, highly refined and purified sucrose. And so, like, you think about you spend time in the Andes, which I have, and everywhere you go, they give you cocaine leaf tea, cocoa leaf. That's what you drink. It's you have altitude sickness, they give you cocoa leaf. You have, you haven't woken up, they give you cocoa leaf. It doesn't matter what it is; they're constantly serving it to you. It's not a huge problem. But when you refine it and you have crystallized, purified cocaine, that is a problem. That is a drug of abuse. And I think sugar should be treated the same.
Mm,
You crystallize it, you purify it, and then you start adding it to everything. Suddenly it's a drug, not a food.
that's
And
a
that's a differentiating quality.
that's a really fascinating perspective. I'm going to use that. I've never heard that before, but I think you're absolutely right. That's a great analogy. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so then
It's a different thing.
back on the business side of things. Then where has Snacktivist gone from the early days of, okay, I think I need to work on a brownie mix, to where you're at today?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so we've really made a massive shift because when you're a nurse and you're like, hey, I want to make these farmer connected, superfood ancient grain things. And then you realize what you're up against, like a highly, verticalized industry, where the centralization in the grain industry is crazy. I mean, it's literally controlled by like 5 large global players. And so you can find farmers that are like, yeah, we want to grow these cool like superfood grains, but now like how do you get it milled? How do you get it processed? How do you get it cleaned? All of that stuff is controlled by the large, vertically integrated, centralized, institutions. And so again, that's another place where I really had to step back and realize that we need to change the entire system. And that's when, I really started to take a deeper dive into agronomy and ag and soil sciences. And I had already I was a grunt in a soil research lab for a while.
Hmm.
So I was like part of the research people that did the early biochar stuff and did the early, soil sciences on looking at post-fire regeneration in northwestern soils, mostly in mountains, but it applies a lot to farmlands too.
Hmm.
And that really got me thinking because I had been that research lab rat, running all those assays and stuff. And I started thinking about the impact of like broader monocrop agriculture. I started thinking about the history of, like a diet related disease, which is now the number one killer globally, but certainly like really profoundly in the United States, and looking at the agricultural trends around the world and correlating them with the dietary trends. And what we find is that they follow the same trajectory. Like as we've, commoditized our grain crops and our food systems, it's created this dietary effect of disease that's totally interrelated. And then we overlay soil health. You look at the death of like soil and the sterilization of the soil globally and the desertification that's happening, loss of topsoil. They all follow the same graph. When you put the graphs all together or you overlay them, they're intricately related. So another thing I frequently think about is that I don't think that we'll have a healthy population, regardless of their diet, until we fix the biome of our soils, our world food system soils. Like everything we eat started in the soil. Even if you eat all meat, that animal ate plants. And so it all comes down to the soil. And we have killed the microbiome of the world's farming soils.
Mm.
And we've also killed our own digestive microbiome.
Mm.
And again, we have to think of the microbiome as kind of its independent entity. It's not just like oh yeah, there's some mycorrhizal over there, but it's actually like its own organism. It's some of the largest organisms on the planet are like fungal mycorrhizal, and that whole rhizosphere has to be repaired. And that's where we're going to start growing higher nutrition, like nutrient dense grains or other specialty crops like vegetables. We have to fix that soil microbiome. So me as an entrepreneur, I'm like building this little tiny company selling baking mixes because it was the only thing we could afford to do because we were totally bootstrapped. So there's nothing sexy about baking mixes, just telling you. It's one of those funny little categories. It's a fine place to start, but it's not our end game. But I was like, we have to repair this whole system, like from the soil up, just like we have to repair our bodies from the gut microbiome up, and they need to happen at the same time. And so that's when I was like, okay, I need to reach out to universities. I need to be working with scientists. We need to make this a cultural movement. And luckily it's happening. I'm not the only person out there beating this drum. I kind of have a unique take on it. I have a unique spin on it. And it's definitely odd that I'm a for-profit. We're a B Corp, but we're a for-profit corporation. Like we're making consumer goods.
Yeah.
Because most of the work we've done out there is like nonprofit sector, government, university. And so I feel like we're an important connection piece to making this like a reality and like impacting consumer markets. And then we have bottom up pressure. That always helps. So that's like a very long-winded explanation to your initial question.
No, it's good. Yeah. So I had a friend a number of years ago travel to Italy. I guess this wasn't too long ago. And he says he can't eat pasta in the US. It just makes him feel terrible. But when he was in Italy,
Yeah.
he was able to eat pasta every night and he felt great. What's up with that?
Right. Well, and you look at like the Renaissance and you look at like Italian culture and you look at like what the Romans accomplished, and they did it living on grains, not necessarily wheat. They mostly lived on barley and millet, believe it or not. Wheat was a great thing. That's why they built huge granaries all across North Africa, which I've gone to and visited personally. But, they built their whole civilization as, they were mostly plant-based people. Meat was kind of a luxury item. But the plebs, which were the root of the Roman empires, were mostly plant-based. And they did amazing things and actually accomplished very complex mental feats. They really, as far as like from, an organized civilization, organized religion, organized architecture, all of that stuff. So a lot of people find when they go to Europe where they haven't embraced this monoculture, chemical intensive farming technique, and they have those more intact old cultivation habits with their soils, that they can eat those foods without adverse effects. I've experienced this myself, like throughout Europe, actually, and even in Africa, like I ate flatbread every day when we were in North Africa, because that's like all you could find pretty much, because we were in really rural Tunisia. But you just go into a little grandma would be sitting in the back of a mini mart making handmade flatbreads called hops. And you'd get that, and you'd get a little jar. It was usually like an old mayonnaise jar, old tuna jar, or something that had fresh pressed olive oil in it. And that's what you live on. You eat that all day long, and you have some fresh fruits and vegetables. And if you're lucky, you might get a little bit of like mutton or something, an egg or some tuna at the end of the day. But, I had no problem with that at all. And this was the kid who like acted in hives every time I would eat a lot of wheat or be around wheat straw or combines. I didn't have that reaction in Europe or in Africa.
Wow.
So there's something going on here, right? Like I was conventional farming kid from Oregon. I mean, these wheat fields I were on were all conventional. So they were heavily sprayed, heavily chemically, fortified with nutrients like chemical nitrogen. You go over to Europe and they have very strict control. Like I just did a wine tasting thing with a guy from Bordeaux who owns a chateau, old world style of agriculture. And they're not allowed to use chemical inputs because they are taught that the reason their wine is special is because they nurture the soil. And the soil is like the thing that they spend. He was like, that's the difference between American wines and French wines is that in France, we take care of the soil. In America, you take care of the grapes. But we know if you take care of the soil will take care of the grapes and will make a superior product. I thought that was very interesting perspective.
Huh. All right. So we may have lost some listeners about this concept of the microbiome, both in our guts and in the soil. Can you teach us a little bit about the basics of what is the microbiome? And, many people have probably heard it in popular science with regard to the human gut, but maybe, just teach us a little bit about what that is. And then I have some questions about soil science.
Yeah, totally. So I think for many people, if they've ever done, and I'm sorry, because it's loud, I'm at a hotel. If they've ever been to Utah and they've ever hiked around like in Arches National Park or in Canyonlands National Park, and you see that cryptobiotic crust, which is a very easy to understand representation of what soil microbiome is all about. And so we get this complex community of things that are living in the soil, because soil is really just mineral substrates and then biomatter and that organic matter. And so you get all these, usually it's a combination of things. You've got your funguses, you've got not as many yeasts, but certainly a lot of microbes. And then you also have a whole community of different organisms, from nematodes to other little bugs. And they call that the rhizosphere. Kind of generally speaking, it's kind of this whole world that lives under the soil surface and around the roots of plants. And you see that when you go to like Arches, because there's a plant and it's always surrounded by this cryptobiotic crust, which is like a complex rhizosphere. And you can't have a plant out there without that little symbiotic community, because that's what traps the moisture. That's what creates the nitrogen, because there's nitrogen fixing bacteria in there. That's what feeds the whole community. And importantly, and this is something that we don't talk about a lot, there's a lot of enzymes that are produced. And these enzymes condition the soil. They make other nutrients more available. So I think theoretically, and I don't have any scientific data to prove this, but when they look at nutrient profiles from crops that are grown in a regenerative agriculture setting, so we have like complex plant rotations, usually have some animal rotations as well, they have a higher nutrient density. That's usually found in the ash. If you ever look at like protein content of wheat, it's like, carbs, protein, and then ash. Well, ash contains all the minerals. And we find it has a very rich ash, all these minerals. And we're like, okay, this soil 10 years ago was being grown conventionally. All of those minerals were not found in the bioprofile of the plant. But then once you switch to a more agroeconomic or agroecological model, where you have an intact rhizosphere, you've got an intact world under the soil, suddenly we have all these available nutrients that are being uptaken, into the plant because they're enzymatically available. Enzymes are what make the world go. I mean, enzymes are like the key and the catalyst to everything in the living natural world. And when you have an intact, alive soil ecosystem, you have all of the things you need for plants to have optimal nutrition. And when you add fertilizers, whether they be organic or whatever, the uptake utilization is improved because you have this intact enzyme thing. And in fact, I forgot to mention one job I had, which was a really strange outlier. I worked for a company called Greenfire in Northern California for a year, and I built hydroponic systems, organic hydroponic systems for them, because I had a botany degree and I was really into all this stuff. And we found that it was an enzymatic additive that they made that was like rich in enzymes that would just make plants go crazy, because suddenly they could uptake all of the nutrients we were giving them. And that also really impacted my whole worldview about agriculture and food and nutrient uptake and how to make nutritionally dense food.
So let's talk about hydroponics.
Nutritionally dense animals.
Yeah. Let's talk about hydroponics for a minute, because it seems to be all the rage. And I keep seeing another documentary after documentary saying that a lot of our food systems are moving to these huge hydroponic facilities, tomatoes and other produce.
Yeah.
Is that a good thing? Is that producing healthier food, or is there a big debate between the soil regenerative community and the hydroponics community? I don't know this world at all, so I'm extremely fascinated.
There is a huge debate. Like always, you have like your, more puritanical thinkers versus like the fringy progressive thinkers. And that happens in every culture, including regenerative ag as a movement and, alternative agriculture. The way I look at it is like, I kind of don't get into that good versus evil dichotomy. I just don't. The plain facts are that a lot of our good soil for growing specialty crops, which are, lettuces, tomatoes, anything that doesn't grow like a cereal crop or like a potato, can be grown hydroponically. And the fact is we have disappearing farmland. Like the world's arable lands are getting gobbled up by suburban sprawl, and desertification. So the infringement of desert that's making them non-arable. And so we have to have hydroponics as a technology to feed a global population in a healthy way in light of that. Whether that's better or worse than the stuff that was grown, like say in the Salinas Valley in California, I don't know. They're growing those in sterilized soils that have been chemically farmed for decades. So they're essentially hydroponically farmed, but they're in sterilized soil instead of hydroponic water. They're both being grown in a sterile environment. I think the best would probably be to start doing more regenerative development of our farmlands that we have left, very intentional city planning so that we're prioritizing poor soil for development over rich soil. And so the rich soil that's left could have some sort of incentivization so it doesn't just get developed into tract housing. It actually gets saved for farming. But that's like a political issue, and that's a tough one. I mean, I have it in my own backyard in Kootenai County, Idaho, being the fastest growing zip code in the country. We're a rural community, and every time I drive out to what used to be all farmlands, it's all tract homes, and it's all just getting covered with Roundup and tons of fertilizer and Bermuda grass because it's all lawns. It's a real tragedy. So because of that, we have to have hydroponics, and we have a lot of urban deserts, food deserts in urban areas that need access to fresh and healthy food. And so from that socioeconomic perspective and geographical perspective, we have to be investing in hydroponics, and we have to be investing in the research that's going to make them better quality. So either growing in pods that are mobile or taking over abandoned buildings. It's kind of what we have to do. Also, if we ever need a planet B, it might be really useful technology for inhabiting Mars or something. I mean, you just never know. You might as well develop that technology and have it and has tested it and know that it works.
Good call. Yes, for sure. So is there hope?
Like kind of sci-fi weird, but
No, like in the movie The Martian and others, there was a lot of soil science and like how is he actually growing potatoes and all that, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But is there hope for us Americans that, in the soil that we have left in regenerative ag, is there hope for us? Is there ways to, all the terms that you threw earlier, which is above me, but around the type of soil, like, is there a way to recreate that in our soils to give us hope? Okay.
Yeah, it can be done. It absolutely can be done. And it is being done in many places. And, farmers are a very sophisticated population of people. They're highly educated. They're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place because the government and the big ag chemical companies and the IP protected seed companies kind of have a stranglehold on them because they don't have diversified channels for reaching consumers. And so when you look at farmers as this kind of sophisticated population of educated people that are, they're trying to move into the 21st century, it gives you a whole new angle of how to approach farmers and farming communities. For one, you have to be respectful and say, hey, you guys have been stewards of the soil forever. Right? You can't be like, oh, you guys have been messing things up for decades, because that's never going to get you anywhere because they've been doing what they thought was the best thing. That's what they've been taught. That's what we've all been taught. What we need to do is we need to have consumer pressure and diversification in the marketplace first. So we have a financial incentive to say, hey, farmers, there's new entities you can sell to. In fact, you can get a better deal. You can be more profitable. You can have more forward leverage because you're not in the futures market. Like working with an entity like Snacktivist, we're like, hey, let's develop a foxtail millet growing program, or like what we're doing in Washington. We're developing a millet growing project in the state of Washington with WSU. Very interdisciplinary. There's many value-added stakeholders involved, including us. And we're going to give farmers the tools they need to diversify. And we're going to give them the path to market to incentivize that diversification. And so that kind of approach gives me hope. It's going to take time. We're not going to, we don't use regenerative agriculture ingredients because they're not available yet. We're just trying to get there. We're building the parachute on the way down right now. And it's what we have to do. And that gives me hope, because the more farmers that start converting, the more we're going to take care of our soil. We can reverse it, and we can push back on that statistic that the UN gave us a couple of years ago when they said, that's it, guys, game up. We've got 60 harvests left, and we're done. The soils will be so sterilized, there'll be no topsoil left. We won't be able to farm anymore globally. 60 harvests. That's when our kids are middle-aged. Our kids will be our age when this happens.
Whoa.
Right. And we're not going to fix that putting everybody on, some special diet. We have to reinvent our staples, like the basic foods that feed humanity. And by incentivizing farmers to go back to what farming was about, 500 years ago, where they intercropped all the time. They never planted the same crops over and over and over again, because the conventional wisdom of the time was, if we do that, after a few generations, we'll have resident pests, we'll have resident nutritional deficiencies, and we'll have resident weeds that infest the area. And so part of the tenets of more permaculture is that you always change. You're always changing, because if you change your crops dynamically, you suddenly don't create that great environment for the resident pests, or you plant things that help nourish the next crop, so you don't get the nutrient deficiencies. Our monocrop model has to change because it's not set up for long-term success, just from a pure numbers game perspective. So that's where we're pushing back. We're trying to create consumer demand for diversified, crops that are coming from farmers. And that is what the hope is to change that matrix, to move away from the monocrop driven paradigm, and to start bringing farmers and ranchers together. So we have, wheat farmers in Eastern Washington that are then bringing in cattle ranchers that come in and they eat on their soil, and then they're pooping on the soil, and then you have the enzymes, and you have a natural turning effect rather than tilling. You have animals doing the work for you. And then that's when we start building soil rather than losing soil. Because every spring in Coeur d'Alene, thousands of tons of topsoil out of the Palouse following tilling season are blown into the Coeur d'Alene basin and dropped. Like, you can write your name on your car. There's so much topsoil. And it's because we have to stop that tilling process. That can't be like an annual thing.
Wow.
And so these diversified crop rotations help to break those cycles of tilling. Tilling, has to happen sometimes, but the more you do it, the more you disrupt that rhizosphere in the soil, and the more carbon you give off. You can see carbon blooms into the atmosphere following tilling season. It actually releases so much carbon in the atmosphere when we till.
Huh.
We need to keep the carbon in the soil, and that's the other big picture thing is by healing our world's agricultural soils and our grasslands, the world's arable lands. We grow a new carbon reserve that can actually sequester enough carbon where we could even potentially push back on the carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution. We could stabilize or help even reverse climate change and global warming by sequestering those greenhouse gases.
Wow.
It's a whole other impact point. Yeah.
Yes. Very, very, very important. So you've been throwing out the term monocrop for a bit in this. For those who aren't familiar, is it essentially what it sounds like, that there's incentivization to just specialize, refine, and then it's bad for the soil, or what? Tell me a little bit more. What is monocropping?
Yeah. So monocropping is an efficiency thing. And the whole concept of monocropping and planting one single species on a huge tract of land really became popular after World War II for a very good reason, because following World War II, we had massive food insecurity everywhere. we had a die-off of young men who were traditionally working the farms. And so women, children, the elderly had to step in. And so there was a massive need for, the machine style agriculture had to happen to feed the world. So, I mean, I don't ever want to feel like, we're blaming what happened. It was a bad thing. Well, it wasn't. It was actually a very natural response to a crisis.
Yeah.
But once we realized that we could increase yield with combine and massive scale farming of one crop, and then massive processing of one crop, and then massive feeding of our population with one crop, we thought, okay, cool, this is the way we can feed the world efficiently. We just didn't think about the fact that it would eventually kill us, kill our soil, and kill that economy, because that was partially responsible for like the farm collapse of the 80s, when, a huge percentage of the nation's independently held farms either collapsed and went bankrupt or got bought up by larger agribusiness or huge farms. And so this monocropping, which is just one, say, look at Iowa, like most of it's corn, the other half is soy. We need to have a more diverse agricultural mosaic. Like our farmland should look really diverse. And that's happening naturally because they know it has to. But, we've got to get away from just these huge monocrop, farm. I think that that's part of the solution myself. Although I've argued with this with people who have some very persuasive arguments why there are problems with that. So that would be another great topic of another podcast with like an agronomist or something. So.
Yeah. I was listening to other podcasts, and I've just found in my own career, and many others know this, but wisdom is often right where there's uncertainty and nuance, right? Because I've noticed a lot of wisdom from you in this conversation, where you sort of understand the why behind the why, and so you're not as judgmental as the typical people that are just loud and saying it has to be this way. And navigating that nuance seems to be lost in most conversations these days. So I appreciate that greatly.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I feel like that's the only way we can move forward, because if we don't have respectful relationships with all the stakeholders and understand why they've been doing things the way they have been, we can't help them. And I have to thank being a diabetic educator and a nurse for that kind of dampering of the hubris, because you start to realize like you're only going to be effective if you meet people where they're at. So you have to meet them at their operational level of, their value system, their experience, their literacy level, all of that stuff. And if we don't do that, your message is falling on deaf ears, or it will be revolted against, because it's perceived as hostile. And this is so important. This movement is so critical to the survival of our grandkids and future generations of humans on the planet. We can't afford to fail because of, hubris and not having effective conversations. So I feel like, I look at like the organic, like boutique elite Nazis, that are just so hostile all the time to anything that's not perfectly organic or super vehemently non-GMO or whatever. It's like, unfortunately, it polarizes the whole movement, and then we don't really get anywhere. So I feel like regenerative agriculture and restorative agriculture is kind of like a happy medium. And right now it's kind of a bit of a war zone because people are debating over what it means. It doesn't have a definition. But I think we have to push back and make it something that people can feel like they can try and not fail at. Like farmers can try and go, oh, shoot, it didn't work so well. So I'm doing conventional this year so I can pay my bills. And then I'm going to give it another try again next year, because then it's a process. We start a process of transformation, and everyone knows that transformation is like, it's the waveform. It always is. So I'm really passionate about evangelizing with that kind of balanced outlook.
So this project that you're doing in collaboration with Washington State University, I like how you framed it earlier, that at the end of the day, it does economic incentives are everything. How practically are you incentivizing these farmers to change things up and try to regenerate their soil? Like how are you creating that economic incentive? Is it through your company, or what is the holistic plan there?
Yeah, not yet through our company, but we're working on putting those together right now. It's really exciting because we're working with a farmer in Kansas growing one ingredient, and then the multitude of farmers with the millet project. And it's going to take a couple of years, because this year we're actually just doing test plots to figure out the best varietals of millets.
Yeah.
Proso, because there's thousands of types of millet. This is proso millet. It's very drought resistant. It's really good for our environment. Like, it's dry here, so it would grow well in our area. But we don't know yet the best varieties for our area, because we have colder nights. And also, we're going to study the carbohydrate evaluation and performance of the carbohydrates. So we're going to actually go do trials with the millet flours or whole millet, and we're going to study how it can go into a fermenter for making malting or sprouted grains, or also just regular flours like what we're currently using. And we're going to study, like, does one outperform the other? Because if that's the case, that's the one we're going to want the farmers to be growing. Our goal in the long run is through these kind of collaborative projects that we can eventually start saying, okay, farmers, A through F, please grow us this many tons of millet and these types of millet, and let's negotiate a price ahead of time, because then they know that there's going to be profit in it. Right now, a lot of the commodities market is all based on the futures market, and you just never know. It's hit and miss. They're going to invest a ton of money to grow a ton of crops, and at the end of the day, if the market demand for that crop drops, they might have been growing it at a loss, and it's not profitable. And then other ones might be profitable. This would give more stability.
Got it.
And so they're going to know. And that is building a whole system. I mean, you can't just invent these kind of farmer direct sourcing plans overnight. So we're actually building a platform for this kind of stuff, so we can have like aggregative buying, we can have aggregative growing, and put it all into a platform that's then blockchain enabled, so that way we know it's authentic and there's not greenwashing. So if like a company is going, hey, we're buying all of our millet from this Washington Association of Millet Growers, and we know they are adhering to these types of farming principles, then it reduces greenwashing. And then there's even potential for like rolling that into some sort of impact of saying, hey, based on all this farming and based on the knowledge that we have, it's all stored in the blockchain. It can't be corrupted, because otherwise it changes all the information downstream. We know that this whole momentum impacted like carbon sequestration by this value, or, like those kind of big grosser measurements and metrics that need to happen as collectives, not as individuals. So
we need to have a whole other podcast on Web3 and blockchains and regenerative ag and supply chains, because that is a fascinating conversation line that I wish we had time for today. But
that's like my favorite topic in the world.
Okay, let's do another one to talk about that. But so coming back to Snacktivist, then last question: what is the vision? Where are you heading with Snacktivist? And what should the world be looking out for, and what can we buy right now?
Okay, so right now, what you can buy is a very small little piece of the tip of the iceberg of what we're planning to do. You can buy baking mix lines. We're launching a finished like pizza crust. Again, it's meeting people where they're at. They want a healthier pizza crust, because people love pizza and they're tired of, either poor quality pizza or pizza that gives them a stomach ache or whatever. And so, we're building our volumes and our momentum using those kind of consumer early adopter kind of products. But as we grow and as we become more of like an entity that's like moving culture and creating consumer trends, like we want Snacktivist to be remembered as like the company that totally disrupted the grain industry and like totally just changed our notion of how we look at grains. Because right now, Americans are trained to think about grains from a very monocrop, highly processed perspective. Oh, grains are bad because it's like white bread, or whatever. But when we look like all the grains out there in the world, and some of them have like intense medicinal properties, like even that one study I sent you is just one of many, where there are actual like measurable data-driven studies showing that some of these cereal crops have actual medicinal properties, and we could be eating them for breakfast. Why aren't we? Why are we eating the ones that aren't good for us? Or why are we shunning that category altogether? Like our conversation earlier, there are definitely individuals that medically need low carb, no carb, keto, etc. And that's a case by case study. But we can't feed the global population, almost 8 billion people, on a keto diet. We'd be extinct in 10 years. Like, it can't work. We have to reinvent our grain sector and make it more nutritionally dense and more sustainable to feed the world into the future. And I want Snacktivist to be known as the company that made that into reality.
I know I said that was the last question, but I would be remiss. I would be kicked in the shins by many of my friends if I didn't bring up the sourdough movement. So a lot of my friends, including us, we make a lot of things based on a sourdough starter that was started, I don't know, generations ago.
Yeah.
What is that?
Right.
How does that relate to this conversation? I'm curious about your thoughts about sourdough-based things.
Yeah, sourdough is amazing, and it totally plays into everything we just talked about, because industrialized yeast has its place. Like, right now, we're using industrialized yeast because we have to. There's not a diversified supply chain for dried yeast that's scalable. But I make sourdough at home. We eat sourdough bread, and historically, grains have always been consumed, mostly fermented. If, like wheats were very seldom consumed without fermentation prior to I think it's the Charlie Warlick process that was developed during World War I and World War II in England. That's when they first commercialized yeast. Commercialized yeast is a monocrop, essentially. It's like purified sugar. It's like, one crop in a field and one purified nutrient, like, anhydrous ammonia, or fertilizer, like nitrogen. It's like anytime you isolate one thing and you take it out of its like bigger, kind of system, including yeast, you get something that's not as healthy for you. Sourdough is like so diverse from a microbial perspective. It's absolutely amazing. And here's a cool thing. Back to the very beginning of our conversation, someday we'll treat our personal biosphere as its own entity. What they've found when they've studied sourdoughs around the world, one of the biggest drivers of differentiation is the people who touch them. And our own microbiome starts to be actually pulled into the sourdough culture to where it's almost like part of you. So when they study sourdoughs that come from a bakery that has like a head baker, the number one person who spends the most time touching and contacting that sourdough, it actually starts to have a genetic microbial profile that reflects the host. And how weird is that?
Wow. And so from a science perspective, how are sourdoughs different than, sourdough breads different than other traditional breads you would see in American kitchen?
Yeah. So not only do you get all like that whole diverse thing, but you get this fermentation process. So like you go in and you take all these things that were locked inside the grain, because grain is a storage vesicle by the plant to put nutrients into something that will be used next spring or next growing season, depending on where it's grown. And so we're wanting to take that nutrient and absorb it into our bodies, or let our gut microbiome eat it, and then we can then in turn absorb those nutrients. And so when you do something with fermentation, whether that be a sourdough culture to a floured, product like actual flour, or like they do in India with millets, they soak them and then they make a slurry and then they ferment the slurry. So it was never powdered into a flour to begin with. They soaked and fermented a slurry. What we know from a nutritional perspective and from a health perspective is that helps make a lot of things nutritionally more bioavailable. And again, it comes back to enzymes. We have all these amazing enzymes that are active even if you don't have the microbial fermentation organisms there. The enzymes themselves are part of the plant. When it rains, it's the enzymes that unlock the seedling. And so you're really harnessing the magic of nature to work for itself to help impact our nutrition anytime you ferment something.
Wow.
Sourdough.
Wow.
Yeah. Sourdough.
Okay, well, I have a million other questions, and I will look forward to our next episode. I think there are threads around Web3 blockchain. There are threads around the soil science. There's threads around how ancient grains and the ways that more healthier soils can be created for healthier grains to be incorporated in our food. I am excited about all those topics. So where can people find you online? Where can people find Snacktivist and order some of the products?
Yeah, so they can find us on Amazon. They can find us on Walmart.com. Of course, like our website, www.snacktivistfoods.com. I have to confess, I pretty much built the website myself, and I am a terrible web designer. And there's so much story to be told, and we're really trying to make that a priority this summer and have some professionals up our game on our website. But you'll get some bits and pieces of the story there, and you can definitely buy our initial product line, our baking mix product line. Right now, our finished products are only for food service, and so we've launched the pizza. We're also working on some like more functional things like focus enhancement. So like we're working on for coffee shops potentially doing a pilot this winter of like little brownie bites that have like cordyceps mushroom and like rhodiola and chonga mushroom and things like that, or like a waffle that has like, you know, ashwagandha and like, you know, lion's mane and like fun stuff in there. Because again, when you look at traditional food systems, food is medicine. You add your supplements to your food. That's always been a tenet until like the last 100 years, most cultures. So we're really excited about exploring finished product category and really taking it up a notch. You know, not only should you be focusing on high nutritional profile ingredients, but why not throw some medicinally enhancing herbs and mushrooms, etc., in there too. So stay tuned for that project. That's a really exciting one.
Awesome. Well, I'll look forward to continued conversation. Joni, I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah, come out to Coeur d'Alene and visit. We'll do it in person.
Looking forward to that. All right.
Take care. Bye.
All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you in your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it'd be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.